have them go for it.
Okay, so congratulations, everybody. We are in the home stretch. We've had a great day. That was a fantastic panel. And now it's the future of work. So arguably there is no hotter area of economics or economic policy than the debate over the future of the workforce. And depending on who you listen to in that debate, we are either about to face some kind of robot apocalypse where all the jobs go away, or we're doing really well. And maybe better than ever in terms of the lack of displacement due to technology. And so you have these two diametrically opposed viewpoints, interpretations of the data at odds with each other. And we thought no better time, no better forum to have that debate live on stage here with a great group of panelists. So let me introduce them now. First, we have Dr. Adam Ozimek, who's a senior economist at Moody's Analytics. We also have Kristin Sharp, who's the executive director of the Initiative on Work, Workers, and Technology at New America. Byron Auguste, the co-founder and CEO of Opportunity at Work. And Spencer Overton, the president of the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies. And moderating today's discussion is Jim Tankersley, who's a tax and economics reporter at the New York Times. So please join me in giving a big round of applause to our panelists.
Hey everybody, thanks for joining us. I just wanted to start the panel by making something really clear. Please, no one here is running for president, right? Okay, so that we know of. Okay, great. We are not going to have, I don't think, the same soaring political rhetoric that you just heard, but we are going to have a lot of talk about whether or not robots are going to kill all of us and take all of our jobs. So I want to dive in right away, and we'll start with Adam as the card-carrying economist on this question, and then let everybody else as the card-carrying experts that they are jump in. Adam, we hear a lot about this sort of apocalyptic idea of the American economy, that in a decade, half of our jobs will be gone to the robots, that will have mass hordes of workers rising up in populist rebellion. What of those things should we actually be scared of? What's true in the future of work?
So I find this a very interesting question to be asked at this point in time, when we're seeing extremely low productivity growth compared to history. So if we had enjoyed productivity growth from the 90s to 2000, if that average had continued, personal income would be $9,000 a year higher. So low productivity growth alongside concerns of automation, to me it kind of strikes me as like worrying about how are we going to manage traffic in the future with all the flying cars in the air. How are we going to do that? Like, it's an interesting thought experiment. I'm glad someone's thinking about it, but why are we talking about it so much? It's just so far off in the future, and what we have right now is a problem of low productivity growth. So, you know, we don't know what will happen in the future. There's no predicting, you know, the path of innovation. But what we can say is there's not really much sign of it. I mean, you have some evidence that automation sort of has been driving some wage polarization, but there's not really any evidence that automation is driving any kind of significant unemployment right now. Instead, what we have is a long hangover from the Great Recession. And I find the automation conversation to be interesting, but really a distraction from the bigger issues, the issue of, you know, recessions and the slow recovery from them that we're still working our way through.
Kristin?
So automation is a fascinating topic because it affects different groups of people differently. And one of the things that we see at New America in working across cities and looking at how to automation-proof the kinds of work that people do is that there's a distinct change in the kinds of work that people are gravitating to right now and thinking about doing. And lots of those types of jobs are becoming things that are more lifestyle directed, related to care, related to education, related to creative or person-to-person interaction type jobs. And those jobs aren't jobs that we see the same kind of defined kinds of growth that we've had historically. And so there's a struggle, I think, in society right now to adapt to the kinds of sort of higher tech, digitized versions of existing jobs and the kinds of person-to-person types of jobs that are growing in the economy right now. And because of that, we're seeing sort of this mismatch.
Yeah, Spencer, which do you think is the right way to think about this? That we're going to have maybe fewer jobs in the future and we need to be thinking about how to deal with it? Or that the jobs of the future are going to require different skills and we need to be thinking about it that way?
Right. Well, my take is that our paradigm of, are we all going to be obsolete versus are we all going to be employed is not necessarily the way to think about it. Kristin talked about different populations being impacted differently by this. At the Joint Center, we found that 31% of Latino workers and 27% of black workers are concentrated in just 30 occupations at high risk to automation. So I think that certain communities may be impacted, and as opposed to ignoring that, I think we need to be intentional about ensuring that different communities have access to building skills.
And you all are working on skills right now. In fact, Byron, can you talk about sort of the skills challenge?
Well, I'd love to answer your question first. I do think
please.
skills are part of it, but in terms of what the, when you enter the impact of automation, future of work, that discussion, I think three things. First of all, work is solving problems, and the last I checked, we're not running out of problems, right? I mean, if you look around you, there's so much work to do. If work is building things and fixing things, if it's inventing things, it's improving things, if work is caring for people and like curing them and healing, there's so much work to do that's going undone. I think the real issue isn't are we going to have work to do in the future. I think the real issue is why are our institutional systems, our government, our financial system, our innovation engine, why are we doing such a poor job at equipping and investing in the work that actually needs to be done? So that's the first thing. Second, specifically with respect to automation, people often say automation, artificial intelligence in kind of one phrase as if they're the same thing. But I think they're anything but the same thing, right? If you think about the Industrial Revolution, there was a phase of it where you were essentially replacing human power or animal power with machine power. I think automation is kind of the same thing in the context of a knowledge economy, right? I mean, you're sort of replacing kind of these sort of routine kind of mental procedures. But there was another phase of the Industrial Revolution later where you actually had interchangeable parts, like the Colt gun factory, right, in Connecticut in the 1840s, and where now all of a sudden, instead of having to master 137 steps to be a gunsmith, and it took you 14 years to figure it out, now you still had to have skilled jobs, but many more people could work in factories. And actually, artificial intelligence is more like the way we're interchangeable parts and machine tools beyond that. And in those phases, it was far from clear that you needed higher skills, right? Like you didn't actually, a master gunsmith was a much more skilled worker than the people working in the Colt gun factory, but there were many, many more jobs for people in the Colt gun factory. So as you really think about this, the assumption that these kinds of innovations that we're seeing in the future will actually destroy jobs or will have a bias against lower skilled people aren't necessarily true. But the third thing is that outcome could still come true, not because the technology wants to do it, but because of the way our institutions work. Right now, there's not a good business model, for the most part, in using these new technologies to invest in ordinary people and to get a return from it. Right now, the business models that are mature are add software, remove people, ka-ching, ka-ching, repeat, right? So the question is, how will our institutional structure, and not just our education system, but our labor markets, the way we hire, many different things, and the way we invest. And we can talk more about the possibilities, but if you look at it, it's really not the tools we should be afraid of, it's the rules. We have a set of institutions that are not good at sort of channeling technology towards kind of mass use, particularly in work, which means that we do end up hitting these productivity gaps. Because if you can't actually, you hit diminishing returns if all you can do to deploy your technology and investment is in a very narrow range of the economy. So I think that's the question we should be talking about.
Kristin?
Yeah, so I wanted to pick up on something that Byron said, which I think is really important, and it's that the systemic and institutional structure that we think about sort of sustaining and getting people prepped for the workforce is out of sync with the kinds of jobs that are out there right now. And you see that across digital jobs, you see it across care and creative lifestyle jobs, you see it across even sort of corporate training programs and freelance jobs. It's that we used to think about training and work as training huge swaths of people for big categories of work. And the kinds of jobs that are on the upswing right now are many, many fewer in big categories of work and much more individually directed and much more sort of one-off kinds of jobs. Senator Booker in the last panel mentioned that the employers in his community say that they can't find machinists. It's because there's no such thing as a machinist anymore. It's 50 different kinds of machinists, all of whom have different skills in using the different kinds of machinery or automated systems or whatever the things are that they're training to. And so your point of needing to develop new systems in communities that are directed to the things that people are working on there, we see over and over again as so important.
I want to pick up on the communities aspect of this and ask sort of a broader geographic question. Is the future of work only in major American metropolitan areas, or is there a role, in fact, an investment to be made in the parts of America that have not seen the same business dynamism that the big areas have over the course of the recovery?
Yeah, we're betting that it is in rural areas as well. We're doing a paper right now on the future of work in the Black rural South. So places in Alabama and Mississippi, how can we, what kind of opportunities are in small towns? So if you think about things like data centers, other things that could be located in relatively rural places, obviously there's got to be some infrastructure for them. We think it's important to think about the future of work in the rural areas as well.
Adam, this is something that you have some personal experience with, right?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of different kinds of success for geographies today, and thinking of the big, major, crowded metro area as the only kind of success, I think, is missing a whole lot of other success stories that are going out there. You have small cities that are doing well, you have rural areas that are doing well, you have largely suburban metros that are doing well. I come from a part of central Pennsylvania that's doing very well, and I think we need to think about what's working there and to appreciate the kind of diversity of the kind of communities that can be successful and the kinds of economies that can be successful, and not think that the only solution is to how do we get more people into these mega cities. Because I think that economists tend to have that focus. This is where productivity is. How do we take people into these high-cost, high-productivity cities? Where instead I think we need to think about how do we sort of replicate these other kinds of successful models, because there's a case to be made for geographically dispersing economic opportunity. If you think about agglomeration and successful places as being places that deliver opportunity, the idea that we would concentrate those in just a few specific areas, I think will leave a lot of people out. Consider if we were going to put all of the colleges into a few small areas, you would think, well, all these people who aren't born near those places, that creates a friction to them getting an education. And if you think of a strong economy as providing those similar kinds of opportunities, it's the economic case for making sure that economic strength is distributed more throughout the country. I think that's an important thing to look at.
It's really strange that people will talk about this concentration as inevitable, because if you take a global view rather than just a U.S. view, the main trend over the last 30 years has been a dispersion of economic activity, and in fact something closer to a convergence, right, of sort of poorer regions of the world. But how did that happen? It didn't happen just by accident, nor did it happen by some central plan. It happened by some places in the world investing in infrastructure, business environment, education, and the like to make themselves attractive places to invest. And it happened through businesses and business networks, in fact, developing intentional supply chains, right? not just sort of randomly created in those ways. And there's no reason why that couldn't work in the United States as well. It's a continental-sized country we have here, and there's every reason to believe that you could have economic activity dispersed. But what would you need? So rural areas, well, do you have broadband? Well, some do. If you're close to university, you probably do. Do you have a way to get people into a talent pipeline? And then I think it's important, and it's something Opportunity at Work, my organization is working on, is not just the skills, but also do you have a way of demonstrating the skills? Because part of how we get into this doom loop in the future of work is that companies now, for the purposes of convenience, as like thousands of people apply for a job, they screen them out just based on their academic background, their work history. So it's a keyword search on your resume. Well, your resume is your history. If you actually, and so even though companies want skills and talk about a skills gap, they don't actually evaluate the skills of most of the people who apply for their jobs. It's only those who pass through the screens, then they evaluate their skills and say, oh, we can't get enough of them. But it turns out lots of people have the skills that are screened out. They learned them on the job, they learned them in the armed forces. 35 million people went to college but never got a degree. Did they learn nothing there? Probably not. And so we are seeing thousands of people and helped thousands of people kind of get considered for career path jobs, and IT is where we started. And so there's a lot of talent out there that we're not touching. So I think the one missing piece is an efficient way of doing inclusive hiring that's skills-based, because if you can get opportunity through your skills, well, you can change your skills. That's called learning. But if the only opportunity can come through your history, you can't change your history. That's lying. So we can define our way into a skills gap, which is what we've done now, or we can open up a lane where people can work. And we're going to need to do that because now there's a lot of people being shut out, but there's going to be more and more and more as the half-life of skills change. It's going to be everybody that's going to need to do that. So today, you just got to surf from good company to good company, from good school to good school. And if you do all that, that's great. But if you don't, you can get shut out very easily. And in a lot of the rural areas, instead of 40% of people with a college degree, you're getting 20% of people. So a ton of people are shut out, to say nothing of then people who have some criminal record or something like that. I mean, there's a ton of people that are just systematically shut out of opportunities for employment, no matter what they do.
One of the great conundrums that I've seen in my years as an economics reporter about this current economy is that it appears to be built for women. That the skills of jobs of the future favor the more college educated, the people who are better, as you were saying, sort of better at customer service and the ways in interpersonal problem solving skills, which are often associated with women in the research, like women who are smart, who can deal with people and who can solve problems are in high demand. And yet, female labor force participation has plateaued and backslid, actually, even as female education and attainment has gone up compared to men. And so my question, Spencer, Kristin, for both of you, is do we have a policy mismatch here that is keeping women out of the workforce and out of these future jobs, or are the demands of those jobs different from what they appear to be on the outside?
I don't think that it's a policy question necessarily that's keeping women out of the workforce. And I don't even know that I agree that jobs that are that rely on interaction or person-to-person work is necessarily work that women are better at. I think we say that culturally, and in a way that disadvantages both men and women in lots of situations. But I will also say that we find in looking at the kinds of jobs that are most at risk for automation, that is also disproportionately female, and that a lot of you always, when people talk about automation and think about automation, and you Google pictures of robots taking your jobs and things, they're always men in factories and men driving trucks and things like that. But in fact, many of the jobs that are at highest risk are executive assistant work, are things that are healthcare coders for hospitals that code the different kinds of services that are highly female-dominated jobs. So in thinking about automation, it's really important to think about how to map the existing skills of those kinds of jobs onto things that are on the upswing as well. But while I think keeping the conversation at everybody needs to move towards more self-directed, independent, creative thinking jobs, not one gender or another.
And just building on that, I mean, if you look at, for example, cashiers, right? Black women heavily represented in terms of the cashier space. Now, there's some male-dominated. We talk about race, things like drivers. Very heavily black male. When we talk about drivers, African Americans are 3 times more likely, and many of to be drivers, and many of those people are male, right, disproportionately. But I think it's really sector and kind of occupation specific.
But when we think about healthcare, for example, which is what I had in mind when I framed the question, I mean, it is clearly an industry of the future. It's not a sexy industry of the future to talk about. It's not flying Teslas, but healthcare is clearly a place where we need a lot of humans to deliver the service, and it is a growing need for services. And we appear to have a need for more workers, particularly in some of these rural areas, than we're getting right now. And so I'm curious, where are those workers going to come from? Do training programs need to change? Do we need to get over some cultural gender taboos to get more people interested in and trained for those jobs?
I actually think culture is massively overrated as a barrier, and I think that there's a lot of institutional. Again, you've got to look closely at the way these systems actually work. So, for example, one of the things that technology is doing is making it very possible for lots of roles that 30 years ago, lots of activities, work that was done by doctors typically, to be done by nurses, to other paraprofessionals. Actually, given that the disease burden in this country is over half chronic care, so it's not acute, it's not surgery, it's like, are you regularly taking your medicine? Like, are you, being careful in the bath, so you don't fall and break your hip? Actually, there's a huge role for healthcare navigators, particularly people in community, right, who have a relationship, who do need to have some skills, but who need to have cultural competency. There's a massive need for this, but many of the things that you would want to organize this business around are banned. No one but doctors can do them because the state medical associations lobby in the state legislatures for scope of practice laws. They specifically do. Look them up. No one's ever on the other side of those debates. So as a result, we literally outlaw the path of evolution of work, the future of work, that would actually give you far more middle-class jobs. That's outlawed. So when it's outlawed, I don't need any sort of grand theories of culture, nor do I need any sort of grand theories of technology to say why we're not going to get more middle-class jobs from the future of work, because we banned it by law in state legislatures. To take an example, I could give you many others.
Yeah, go ahead, I'm sorry.
The question that is, I thought, interesting there was this question of pathways too, though, and visibility into pathways, because we see over and over again in talking to communities across the country that people say, well, what do I train for? Like, what do I go into? What kinds of things are the things that are, possible for anybody to do in the next 10 years? And there is not good visibility either at the community level in, rural or rural adjacent areas, or at the individual level of what kinds of training, upskilling, new mapping of my existing skills onto other things should I do? And that, in and of itself, you need both the regulatory change and also you need the cultural change of let's talk about the things that are growing.
Just building on these couple points, certainly the occupational licensing issue is a barrier and a challenge. I think this other thing that we don't talk a lot about is this concept of good jobs, solid jobs. You talked about it in terms of middle-class jobs. So certainly healthcare is great, but often very low paying. And one question is, how can we use technology to kind of upskill that? When we talk about telemedicine and other things, are there some opportunities there? So how can we find and create good jobs for folks is, I think, a really important question.
It's actually a central question, I think, right now that is being confronted particularly by Democratic politicians with their eyes toward the next, this election and the election in 2020.
As well as tens of millions of Americans who are struggling.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, man. But as a policy, good jobs has been the fundamental issue for Americans and American voters for basically a generation. And so now, though, we are seeing a much different suite of policy proposals coming forth than we have before. Universal basic income proposals, job guarantee proposals. Curious what you all make of this new batch of thinking and whether you think that it is actually the right sort of area in which to be exploring for essentially government to be mandating or using its own powers to solve the good part of the good jobs problem.
So the thing that I find interesting about the the jobs guarantee and the universal basic income is, right now, about 78% of people who are in the prime working age have a job. And in 2007, that was 79%. So we've gone from 79% to 78%. If we rewind to 2000, it was at about 82%. So we're about 1 to 3 percentage points of prime age workers below where they should be. And we're headed in the right direction. And in this environment, it seems completely strange to me to say, okay, how do we offer good jobs to 25% of all workers? Or maybe we should send a check to every single person in the country. I mean, those are not targeted approaches. Those are extremely expensive, extremely broad approaches. And what you have is a targeted problem. How do we get from 78 to 79%? How do we get from 79 to 82%? Instead of thinking of things like the earned income tax credit, which targets low-skilled workers that are having the hardest problem getting back to work, instead of thinking of, counter-cyclical policy and monetary policy, things that are actually appropriate for fighting recessions, which is, the major cause of the low decline in employment rates, we're focusing on these massive policies that don't really address those problems. And quite frankly, if you're going to increase the federal spending by $1 to $3 trillion a year, they're going to come with all their own kinds of problems in terms of discouraging work and requiring high taxes and crowding out programs that are more targeted and more effective. So I would prefer to see the conversation focus more on the actual problems and really identify what are the margins where we need help, and to focus on those things rather than policies that to me seem aimed at some future that may or may not arrive.
I think we definitely need to be sensitive to the hardships that folks face, right, and not ignore the difficulties in job transitions, right? That said, I don't know that for example, a federal job guarantee discourages work per se. Now, maybe you were talking about UBI as opposed to a federal job guarantee, but I don't know that it does. And I would also argue that UBI could essentially be a subsidy for companies, right, to pay workers low wages, whereas a federal job guarantee is actually competing with the private sector and maybe driving up wages of folks. I'm not saying endorsing either piece. I'm just saying that I think we need to be realists and be sensitive to the notion that folks need some resources to transition. At the end of the day, in terms of being a competitive country, we need skills. We need folks to be innovative, and we need skills. So we can't really get around that. That's something that's got to be at the forefront.
It's funny to, Senator Booker in the panel before talked about, we got to stop doing stupid things. I think that was the quote, which I would endorse. And it's funny to be talking about, should the government be mandating that people can get good jobs, when actually there's a lot of specific government, not mostly federal government, that is actually mandating that people can't get good jobs, right? And by the way, there are business practices that mandate that people can't get good jobs, right? Even if they can kind of work their way towards it in the way it works. So I do think, setting aside the question of, long-term UBI as a societal insurance policy and those kind of interesting questions, I think the more immediate thing is we talked about occupational licensing. We talked about scope of practice laws. These are actual rules that people can't do things. I talked a little bit about the fact that you can't get considered for all sorts of jobs unless you have a college degree, which fewer than 40% of Americans do, and in many places it's 20%. And it's not practical to just go back and get one and freeze your life and somehow, push it. But then, take, now on wages, take the way home health care or elder care is reimbursed, right? And CMS, Medicare, and Medicaid are the dominant payer. They're basically reimbursed, on a sort of a time and materials and procedure basis, which means that the only effective business model is a low-wage business model. Now, if they were reimbursed based on quality, right, based on, then you could train everyone who works in an elder care facility in cognitive behavioral therapy, and to train them to build the agency, right, of their clients, and to have a client service mentality, and to make lives happier, to lower morbidity. That is worth paying for. And if we would pay for it, then you could have a competitive model that was a high training, higher wage, middle class wage model that actually had better results. And there was legislation passed at the tail end of the Obama administration that allowed that to happen, and CMS has started to run pilots. I believe the current administration has put those on hold. But and look, that doesn't fit on a bumper sticker, but that is real work we could do that would allow businesses to actually compete on a high road basis with training and better pay, and to actually win that way, right? Costco can do a higher wage strategy because it has a membership fee. If it didn't have it, it couldn't do it. That's a business model. If you can't get paid for higher quality, and right, training doesn't make anyone cheaper, it makes them higher quality. If you can't get paid for higher quality, you can't. That's a huge sector of the economy. So I could give you 50 other examples, but the point is, if we're going to throw up our hands and say we're not willing, this is not an important enough issue to do the real work, to understand what it takes to allow people's talent, ability, drive. I don't know about you, but I know tons of people, and I know very few people who are not willing to work if they can see a path to do something better. But we're blocking their path in so many ways. So I would say, before we say how can we reach down and help these poor people, I think we could start by saying, how about we take our boot off their neck and maybe give them a hand up.
Kristin, what do you think is the best policy initiative we could do to help make sure that the future jobs are better jobs?
I mean, I don't know that I have a good answer for that right now, because I think we're in an experimental phase where we're thinking about that. The basic identification of the problem that UBI and jobs guarantees and everybody who's thinking about this on a big picture level, the basic identification of the problem is right, that we used to get economic stability from our jobs. People used to stay in the same kind of job or industry for 20 to 30 years. Everybody used to have a pension. There used to be like a very specific process where you saved through your job. And that's not the case anymore. A lot of people switch different jobs at different times. A lot of people go freelance and back. Like, there's a lot of different approaches to the structure that we have in the way we work now. And we haven't figured out the systems as a society to backstop that yet. And I think that all of these efforts are, from EITC to UBI to private sector approaches that sort of figure out ways to train people as they go. All of those things, or other kinds of benefits, all of those things are attempts to answer the question of how do you get economic stability if you no longer get it from your work.
Okay, so we've got just a couple seconds left here, so I wanted to go down the line and just ask, do you all think that future technological developments will be positive or negative for workers overall? Adam?
Positive.
Positive.
Positive, but we got to focus on particular populations here, right?
Right. Who do you think is most at risk of being left behind by those?
I think that segregated communities, whether they be Latino, African American, Native American, I think particular communities, people in Appalachia, I think particular communities that are detached from the rest of the economy are in significant need of support.
I mean, I agree with Spencer, and I think these are really extreme cases, right, of isolation and economic, marginality that we have to deal with. But I think the larger risk, because I absolutely believe the technology has massive positive potential. We haven't talked too much about that, but there's all sorts of ways. I mean, there could be AI skills patches that fill your skills gap and work with you, right? I mean, in order to sort of do a job that you can almost do but not quite. I mean, I could give you 10 other examples of amazing ways we could use this technology for a better future of work. The problem we need to worry about is the fact that today it's not just the sort of the 10% or 15% that Spencer, you might be talking about in these areas. Like, half the labor market today, the current state of work, not the future of work, isn't working for half of Americans. And the half that make the decisions about how we deploy the technology, how the laws are made, et cetera, it's working just fine for us. So I think that's the blind spot in our political economy, is that I think most people think in this room, probably for the most part, you think, yeah, things are going pretty well. But in fact, there's a lot of people who feel like they've been living through a 30-year recession, and they're out of time and out of hope. And I think we're not actually that serious yet about really getting underneath what needs to change, and I think we need to get serious very quickly. But if we do, yeah, I absolutely think the potential is there for a much better outcome than the doomsayers are saying.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. Thank you for your attention, and appreciate the panel very much.